Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that we've been doing with settler colonialism in space. I obviously think that this series is really important because throughout these videos I've kind of always talked about how I think that the kind of critiques that are being offered by settler colonialism really have interesting things to say about like space and the desire to reach space as a whole. I think that there are a lot of really interesting reasons why settler colonialism is such a prevalent case in this area, simply because I feel like settler colonialism just has a lot to say about spatialization in general, and the space race as well as like its relationship to just like colonization as like a process that kind of repeats itself throughout history is one that is like really interesting in terms of how telling it is about like what desires lead us to go to space. And so I think that is a really core criticism that you really need to be prepared for, whether you're trying to figure out what types of core criticisms you should be reading or what types of arguments you need to be answering. And so hopefully this video and the ones that kind of accompany it so far are really helpful in being able to just like prepare or think about this argument as a whole. And in this video I want to continue that series by talking like how do teams answer settler colonial abs on this resolution. I think that this is a really interesting place to talk about this because there are so many different ways in which these affirmatives can be written in red, and so I'm going to try to cover as much as I can in terms of like what the different possibilities are and how you can be responding to them from the vantage point of case arguments, framework arguments, criticisms, counterplans, and disads. All of these things I think are like really important considerations to make to think about like what versatility you have in your neg arsenal versus this type of argument. And so hopefully these videos are like really helpful in terms of like actually being able to like push you to kind of think about all of the avenues that you could take. And so in this video I kind of want to just start off by thinking a little bit about like what are some of the main case concerns that you should make. I feel like I kind of want to keep the way in which we've kind of been separating or thinking about two abs from the last video that I did where I talked about how settler colonialism could be read on the affirmative, where I began just thinking about like what the affirmative kind of looks like on the side of like ones that are really affirming indigenous futurism, thinking about alternative ages that can be used to like talk about space in different relationships, like how we're able to carve out like a way to think about space that doesn't produce like Western-centric notions of how we relate to spatialization in the process of colonization. While I think that there is also a lot of ways to kind of like use the resolution as a setup to just like refuse the desire to go to space as a whole, arguments like refusal, incommensurability, etc. I think are really good viable app methods because the resolution really only asks you to focus on the private kind of sector portion of the resolution and whether or not that specific instantiation of space is kind of like morally good or not. And so I think that you can kind of stick it all on just like an affirmative note to that question in ways that I think are really generative. And so I think when you're trying to answer those types of arguments, when you're dealing with the first group of affirmatives, and I think that indigenous futurism definitely lends itself to being able to lose a lot more to some of the uniqueness on the resolution. I feel like no matter if you're trying to set yourself up for a counterplan or dissat or make arguments about like framework or whatever later on, it's really important to like force the other team to define the difference between their operation of space and space privatization to make sense of like how like private actors are restricted but the affirmative is allowed to still act is like really important, because I feel like in a world where they don't have ways to particularly check instantiations of space privatization, then there are a lot of arguments you can make about like how that individualistic frame of how we should respond to the status quo ultimately opens up holes for space to become like neoliberalized, operated by like people that are able to kind of realize the worst forms of the colonial desires that are being critiqued by the affirmative. And I think in that case you have a lot of like solvency deficits to push in terms of like how they don't access like the advantages to getting rid of privatization. And then I think on the other side, a lot of the other case arguments that I feel like are good against indigenous futurism, there are really cool arguments I feel like to make about just like why we should kind of like refuse the future as a whole. I think that making arguments about like why critical theory based in like the ideas about like why the future is safe could really open you up to a wide range of like criticisms or reasons why they're just thinking or thoughts. Are there thoughts about using futurism outside of the paradigm of like law and legality could be ones that don't actually give us the tools to create like the necessary detailed changes in the way that space is being used now, which is like extremely necessary because of the like science and technical nature of like the space conversation itself, all of which I think is like really important to how you're kind of like framing what your offense will look like as you go on. I think that on the other side, when you're looking at affirmatives like ones that are trying to look more towards like simply refusal, I think you need to make arguments about how regardless of whether or not they refuse the private usage of space, there's still an inevitable space race by different global entities that are trying to find avenues in order to like seize the space in order to refuse it from being a global commons. I feel like there are a lot of arguments to make about why there's so much uniqueness in the direction of like how we need to be able to like not just stop space privatization but be able to have a way of thinking about how we deal with space broadly in an international level, and without a way to check that, then like the kind of like refusal or incommensurability or kind of like epistemology of the affirmative kind of like fails in this vein of being able to resolve some of the core kind of concerns of the resolution. And I think that making these kind of places interesting solvency deficits for you to use the resolution smartly for whatever type of argument setup you really want to make later on is really important to just testing how the affirmative is really relating to the specifics of the resolution outside of just space as a concept. I then think that when you're kind of transitioning into how you're making framework T concerns against the indigenous futurisms, I think that it's like really interesting actually to think about like how the offering of a different futurism could like open up like different avenues for like extra T and makes debates about like what privatization is messy. I feel like your arguments against affirmatives that are actually reading indigenous futurisms affirmatives could have like a really good avenue to make about like why indigenous futurism is actually privatized like space exploration, and make arguments about like why that actually is in the opposite direction of the resolution, which I think allows you to have like a lot more arguments to push like procedurally about like why their understanding of the resolution kind of shifts our ability to have conversations about like the core kind of like context of like whether or not privatized space exploration is good or bad, and turns it into a question of just whether like certain types of examples of that are good and bad, which doesn't actually allow us to figure out how we're able to like create law or sustain debate over the year, and like also opens the resolution up to really like extra topical envisioning as a space that are completely like outside of the affirmative kind of grounded in the resolution. And I think that being able to force teams to kind of like defend their offense there can be an easy place for you to kind of like start being able to like create a model of debate that is like that like would push out a lot of these affirmatives that are existing. And I think that on the other side, a lot of the other arguments that could be read against like an app that's just like refusal, incommensurability, etc., is just, I feel like, arguments about like why those types of responses to like legal questions doesn't actually allow us to gain like tools to do the active decentering of like Western epistemology in the context of the law. I feel like the argument needs to be that refusal kind of like seeds those conversations instead of doing something to actively kind of like intrude, critique, and change and shift the way in which they kind of like work as paradigms. And I think that making arguments about like why being able to understand those kind of technical details as like really important to the way in which like the public is able to take up space, or like how space is kind of like used inevitably in the future, is like super important for you to kind of like think about as ways that you could like maybe change up or diversify the type of impacts you're going for outside of just like whether or not you're able to win like some of the procedural arguments that we were talking about before. And so I think that depending on the way in which they're reading the affirmative, you can pivot back and forth between these types of argumentation. And so hopefully this video is really helpful in giving you a good idea of how you can start responding to these affirmatives, and you'll tune into the rest of what I'll be doing. Thank you as always for watching, and yeah, hope you tune in for more.